I've often quoted as saying I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston Telephone Directory than by the 2,000 people on the faculty of Harvard University.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
They share our beliefs, our convictions, our hopes, and our dreams. These are the conservatives of the heart. They are our people.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Nate and Marlo.
Johnny's working on a project today, so Nate and I will be joined by Dave Reaboi, a fellow at the Claremont Institute, to discuss the subject of national divorce, a concept that Dave coined and that has picked up attention, especially among conservatives. Thanks for joining us today, Dave.
It's a pleasure.
So our conversation with Dave today will be especially lively, since I think Dave is going to spend a lot of it telling me I'm wrong about my opposition to a national divorce. But before we get into that debate, and before Dave describes to our listeners what a national divorce even is, Dave, we want to know what books or texts generally influenced your broader thinking on this particular issue.
So the one thing that I can say more than anything was Allan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind, which I read in, the very early 2000s. And that made me see that the differences in conceptions, chiefly of justice and things like that, are really not to be trifled with. And there is and has been a massive divide in the United States and, indeed in the Western world over the course of these things. And it's gotten to the point where the differences are so acute, it's hard to understand this as the same country. Another book, of course, was Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell, which is a total classic. But it already kind of needs updating in the in a time where the stakes are so high. So speaking of the stakes, I'll add Michael Anton's fantastic book last year called The Stakes.
Thanks, Dave. So we'll talk more about his thinking about national divorce throughout the conversation we have. But before we continue, I'd like to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Our mission at ISI is to educate for liberty. And if you would like to help us in that mission, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself.
So, Dave, just before we sort of get into a discussion of the merits and the drawbacks to national divorce, can you give listeners a basic sense of what national divorce is and why you think it's the best way forward for America?
Sure. Well, I'm not sure I can do that because I don't think it's the best way forward for America. I think, I'm not here exactly to promote the idea. When I talk about it, and I've written and spoken about it extensively for at least the last year, but really have been gestating and thinking through this since about 2013. I believe that we're going to be facing what, amounts to a national divorce scenario anyway. I think that the sort of the fundamentals of reality dictate that all human things must end, all empires fade for, a variety of different reasons, but probably for certain very, very explicit reasons that are predictable and understandable, namely the change between the founding ethos of the state and sort of whatever comes next, and it's a sort of natural devolution, the same as entropy. So when I talk about national divorce, I use it as a little bit of a wake up call or cudgel to say, hey, look, we need, when this comes, or even if it doesn't come until we're long gone, we need to understand that we are two separate peoples living in the same state, and thus we need our own institutions. We need our own ways of communicating. We need our own supermarket chains. We need our own manufacturing plants, things like that, because we've entered a time now, and it's not exactly going to lessen, but we've entered a time now where, as far as the left goes, I mean, they really want, they cannot stand that we want to live a separate way. I think federalism is a joke now. It's just completely silly. You can't force someone into federalism if they don't want to if they don't want to sort of think that way about their government. So this is a way that I'm using to get people to understand that, yes, there is a divide and we need to do something about it.
So in the inevitable situation that national divorce comes, because there's this whole sort of genre now of discussion of possibility or the inevitability of national divorce. I was on Canadian TV the other day talking to this guy, Stephen Marsh, who you might be familiar with. He's a left-winger who is writing a book about the coming American Civil War. And he's also saying it's inevitable. He lays out a couple different scenarios of what a national divorce would actually look like. From his perspective, it's all enormously partisan, right? It's all insurgent right-wingers, assassinating a duly elected Democratic president. What do you think are the most likely scenarios, like in an actual sort of material way, that how would national divorce come about? Like, what would be the spark, and what would it actually look like?
Well, I mean, that's the thing. We don't know, but in my opinion, the most likely scenario is one that follows a financial collapse of some sort. That to me just seems the most likely. I don't think it's, if you go back to the time of the Great Depression, something depression scale today, I think would be absolutely enough to set off a chain of events that would lead to national divorce. 1929 and in the early 30s, you're in the midst of the crash. America still had, frankly, the population hadn't changed that much. There was still a shared sense of, a sense of reverence for the founding in some way. Maybe not amongst the intelligentsia by then, but still certainly with the people. And I think it's easy to say that in 1929, 1930, Americans left and right had more in common than they do today.
So it seems like, in the discussion of how it would actually play out, there are sort of pragmatic objections, I think, to the national divorce question, and then there's sort of moral objections. The pragmatic ones are the ones that I've written about a little bit, and it seems like the most obvious sort of way to push back on the idea that national divorce is inevitable, or that in some cases it's preferable, is that it would require a massive sort of exchange, I think. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, between blue cities and red states and red rural areas in blue states, because unlike the first time that we dealt with the national divorce question during the Civil War, there isn't a distinct geography that could secede. The divides in America today, they are, you've got two coasts and a middle America, so you split into 3 or 4 countries probably. But B, they're also rural and urban, right? I mean, I'm sure you've experienced these objections before, but how would national divorce actually play out given those difficulties?
How do I deal with them? Well, I mean, I deal with them in a kind of simple way, which is that we're not there yet. Things which seem inconceivable and horrible will, become subjects of debate, eventually when things go awry. I mean, because I'm not proposing this, I understand that, I feel like I don't really have to deal with objections as they stand today, but things, in the future will not be as they are today. And, for example, in 1984, would you have imagined a Donald Trump figure winning against a Ronald Reagan figure? It's inconceivable. But here we are. So, I mean, I say this not as someone who says, yay, national divorce. I mean, hey, I would love more than anybody, I would love to not be ruled by these people, which is to say the left. I know that they want to rule us, but I would absolutely jump at the idea of living in a Republic of Florida. But that said, the objections you raise are totally valid. I think there's a kind of the inevitability thing where circumstances change and different things become palatable. That's one aspect. The other aspect too is that a lot of this stuff is happening naturally, especially in regards to population, let's say organic population transfer, or what they call the big sort. For the last, I guess since COVID, or really for the last year, we've seen amazing movement away from sort of the most oppressive and blue of the blue states to red states, specifically to Florida and Texas, and of course other places as well. But But those people represent the people who could sort of easily afford to do that. And there will be a next wave where people will say, you know what, things are so bad that I'm going to leave my medical practice. I'm going to leave, the home and maybe some of the old relatives that I have back in these blue states because I just need to get out. So this is another sort of example of how, as the pot boils, the reality changes.
But wouldn't the big sort of be an alternative to national divorce in and of itself, right? If you have people, I mean, in a way, like certainly our system of federalism is beleaguered, to say the least. But there is still a reality in America where people in Texas live differently than people in California. People wouldn't be moving from California to Texas if that weren't true. And it seems like in many ways, the big sort actually, it seems like you're suggesting that that's making the pot boil, but there's an alternative reality in which it could be reducing the temperature and actually could be a way to avoid the issue of national
right.
divorce.
So big sort plus federalism equals, everybody happy, but we're not going to get that. I mean, I've read a number of pieces arguing for federalism or a return to federalism, and I can't wrap my head around how this is a thing. I mean, heck, national divorce is more likely than we get, the left to accept federalism.
Do you think that, on the subject of California refugees and perhaps even people moving from places like the Midwest or the Northeast to Florida, I'm curious, how much do you think COVID has had to play in this big sort? Like how much has that specific event, more than anything in the recent memory, impacted? Perhaps do you see some sort of acceleration to national divorce because of that, or do you see that as kind of just a blip of influx of people to Florida for a variety of different reasons?
Well, I think COVID has done the most to to affect this type of change. But look, I mean, it's not. COVID has also activated many, many millions of people who are, let's say, politically agnostic or not part of the process. All of a sudden now they understand that there's a difference between blue leadership and red leadership, at the state level, and then also, frankly, at the federal level, because they see the red states doing great, and then they see a heavily partisan media and a Democratic administration attacking the same things. So this awakening process, I mean, I know I've seen it in my own life with friends who are just completely apolitical, and now all of a sudden they are activated. They're aware of these massive differences, which is, frankly, another ingredient. I mean, you could call it radicalization, you could call it enlightenment, but it is at base a large, growing difference between sort of two different visions of how we want a country governed. And of course, it's even more than that. I mean, when Sowell wrote Conflict Divisions, he was only talking about government and how people relate to the government, which is, of course, a huge thing. But now we've got things like how, people questioning the reality of biology, or other things like that. Like, it's gotten a lot more serious.
So I wouldn't hesitate to use the word radicalized. I was radicalized by COVID, and particularly by sort of summer 2020. But for me, that led me towards wanting to commit my energy and sort of, my life, frankly, to overthrowing the progressive regime, which, you're right, Dave, has an enormous amount of power, entrenched power, particularly at the federal and national level. It seems like you're saying that radicalization process that you're describing won't be enough to overthrow the entrenched powers in places like DC and in the media and in the academy, et cetera, but it will be enough to catalyze something like national divorce, which presumably, if national divorce is going to happen, that would require the assent, I think, of the federal government, right? I mean, I don't think the military brass is going to take Red America's side in this.
Well, the military brass might not, but, with all probability, the military itself will. We're going to be seeing convulsions. I mean, this isn't easy. I mean, part of this sort of debate is that like we can sit down at a table and sort of hammer out the new conception of the way things are going to be. But in fact, it's going to be horrible. And I mean, I'm here to tell you that it's not going to be great. It's going to be horrible. And it will, and frankly, it will be something, a lot of it will sort of come out of nowhere and be a surprise, both positive and negative. That's just the way politics works and the way life works. But as far as the DC, I mean, I think it's a dead end. I think change in DC is an absolute dead end. After having spent, I guess, more than half my life there, involved in politics, I can tell you that the deep blue administrative state that is sort of the engine of the way policy happens in the United States is not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere. We don't have enough people to fill the slots. I mean, this was a let's say at best, in the best conception of the Trump administration, there were not enough bodies to fill the seats when it came to the, I don't know, sort of 15,000 some folks who were appointed. Now, if you add, those are the people who are appointed. If you add the sort of, let's say, what people call the deep state, you add all the people who are actually not appointed but are career workers, you get to tens of thousands of people. And we just do not, let's say we, meaning the right, we do not have a conveyor belt that will create an infrastructure like this. We just don't have the people. When I'm talking about national divorce and I'm saying, hey, there will be a time when we need our own people, it's sort of a call to say, hey, wake up, go into these fields, create your own universities. I mean, we have Hillsdale. Who else do we have? I'm not sure. Certainly in Florida or in Texas, there is room for 16 different Hillsdales, and then schools at the graduate level that don't teach complete insanity. I mean, I just saw yesterday someone sent me a James Madison University professor's profile, and she had blue hair and horns in her official profile. I mean, this is, we've gotten to the point where this stuff is a punchline even before we get to the insane political ideas.
No, Dave, just on that point, I know something that me and you have talked about before is the right, and Michael Anton, I think he spoke with IM 1776 about this. The right's kind of, obviously the left has a hegemony on art and culture. And you mentioned, rebuilding, or rather just building these institutions from scratch to counter the left's monopoly on the universities, on art, on culture. I was looking at the National Endowment of the Arts, I think, just the different grants that they give out, and the Genius Grant. And so the Genius Grant is like $600,000, I think. It's something like it's a very generous grant. And some of the different recipients who were receiving it, it was entirely focused on like buzzwordy identity politics stuff that, average people literally do not care about. It's not to mention right of center or anyone kind of not in this, the cognoscenti of academia and the kind of identity where people hold identity grievances, things like that. So what do you think on that note? I mean, you are interested in the arts. You were a musician. And what do you think about the right creating their own forms of, like, whether it's creating their own Vogue magazine or their own orchestras, their own art academies? Like, how do you even go about that? And what are your thoughts on just the complete vacuum that exists on the right in that regard right now?
Right. Well, I mean, I know some of the folks who received MacArthur Genius Grants back when it meant something. And, and let's say it's a different caliber of people right now, sort of across the board, from sort of all types of the arts. But I have a kind of mixed emotions about the art scene on the right, because I think, let's say, it requires a scene. It requires physical, physical closeness in a community. not virtual. The virtual thing is I think is nonsense in terms of how to foster real creative relationships over time. I think it can possibly happen with one or two people connecting, but it can't happen with a mass of people connecting. Folks have to be in the same geographic location. And to that point, today, it's very hard to have folks in cities. I mean, this is why cities were popular with art scenes. There's no art scene in, there was a non-urban art scene in the Hamptons in the 1950s, but it included all the people who lived in New York who would go out to the Hamptons. So you need a kind of city. You need a city for this. And increasingly, cities in the United States are getting unlivable. And it all has to do with the rents. And I know I keep harping back on this on so many points, but I think the creative class of people living in a city, or frankly living anywhere, is a sort of lower middle class, or let's say middle class strata. If they cannot afford to live in a city and do their work and say, you know what, I'm going to work a part-time job so that I can be a musician, or I could be a painter, or I could do this and that. If they can't, or a bartender or whatever, if I can't do that feasibly, then I'm just not going to do it. We have a problem where my sister lives, for example. My sister lives in the suburbs in Florida. And she was saying they have no buses to pick up the kids. And I said, what do you mean? You can just buy buses. The school isn't broke. And she said, no, they have a line of 50 buses sitting there. They just have no one to drive them, because no one can take, a $50,000 or $40,000 a year bus driving job anywhere within 100 miles of where they live. So this is the same thing that happened in New York, and now it's replicating elsewhere. And I think among other things, among like middle class lifestyle and all this stuff and livability in the United States, that has a lot to do with the art scene and how potentially an art scene can develop on the right or frankly on the left or anywhere.
So David, I agree actually wholeheartedly with the points that you're making about the fundamental divisions that we're dealing with in America, right? I mean, the divisions, they get to the heart of, the nature of citizenship, of national identity. We can't even agree at what a man and a woman are anymore, right? I mean, you alluded to a lot of this. It's very difficult to share a political community when you can't agree on these fundamentals. Same basic insight that Lincoln had, right? A house divided against itself can't stand. And you alluded to this at the in your answer to one of the first questions we asked, but it seems like this difference in the conception of justice runs through the heart of Western civilization right now. It's not unique to America, and it has as much to do with divisions between a sort of international, transnational class of people who are educated at elite universities and the people who are sort of living either by virtue of their work or by virtue of their geography and proximity to that class and its cultural tastes, and the rest of the West, right? So that's why you have the sort of divisions between the working class, which is more sort of place-bound and conservative, and an elite, which is increasingly cosmopolitan, liberal, not attached to national identity, et cetera. If that is true, then is national divorce really would that require a national divorce in Western civilization, and what would that look like exactly? Because it's like I think you'd agree to a certain extent these problems are not unique to America.
Yes. Okay. Two points on that. The first point is regarding let's say the elite, the transnational liberal elite, right? Technology and social media in particular has made that transnational elite. You've got lower middle class people, or even lower class people in West Virginia now on pushing the most avant-garde ideas about race and gender and all this stuff. So it's not. I mean, you don't exclusively have to have let's say high earning urban liberal elite. I mean, anything that would count as elite doesn't necessarily apply now, just because of the way technology and information propaganda is distributed. The other point is that in other countries in the West where they have this problem, there is a strong national identity and a strong history because of massive immigration, and chiefly, and real demographic change, combined with the fact that we have lost our way when it comes to the founding, we've got nothing tying us together. Hungary can go, actually, Hungary is a bad example. France can go as left-wing as it wants, but at the end of the day, there will be a resurgence of what it means to be French, because still in France, even today, most people are French. Most people can trace their roots back. It is a unique culture, and it's something that people can identify with across the generations. Similarly, let's take Israel for example. Israel can do utterly stupid left-wing things, which it's doing right now. But at the end of the day, it is Israelis are united by a common bond of religion, which also exists in other places. I like to talk about Brazil a lot. Say what you will about the problems that Brazil has. National identity is not one of them. Understanding who Brazil, what is a Brazilian, they all know, and there is a common culture. And in the United States, you don't have that. You've got a massive empire that's united by nothing but ideology at the founding, or let's say even as of 100 years ago. Well, what happens when there's no unifying agreement about the nature of that ideology, which is the situation we find ourselves in now? The whole thing comes apart. It must come apart. If there's nothing holding the thing together, it's got to come apart.
So do you think, again, it's impossible to have these discussions without avoiding reference to the Civil War, because this is the last time this major question came up. But do you think that our divisions now are more significant than they were during the Civil War? Because it seems to me that to say that Civil War or national divorce is inevitable, one has to think that either Lincoln was wrong to fight for the Union, or that the divisions that he was confronting in his day are not as significant as the divisions that we're confronting in our day.
Well, I don't want to say he was wrong, but I think today's divisions are far more significant. Even in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, the lead up to the Civil War, you had a lot of people who had, they didn't have very strong opinions about slavery, let's say. Frankly, a lot of those folks, especially outside of urban areas, they didn't know what was going on, really. They had allegiance to their particular locale, and they had allegiance to their families and, the sort of local hub around them. This is not the case now, sort of emphatically. My neighbor here in Miami Beach has more in common with someone on the Upper West Side than with me. So that is to say, I think it's going to be different. I think it's going to be different. And I'm sorry, what was the other part of the question?
Well, just not just the question of what it would look like in practice in terms of the Civil War, but also in terms of the actual fundamental divisions we're facing, right? The disagreement in the Civil War was whether or not a country can exist half man, half slave, and whether or not, you could own property in men. That to me seems pretty significant, and that's not to discount the challenges that we're facing today. But what is the case for our divisions today being more significant than those divisions?
Even the man, the woman question. The fact that when I talk about the justice question, what does that mean? That means blind justice versus a conception of justice that is sort of really not justice, which is to say it's a sort of it's using the state as an instrument of revenge in different cases based upon let's say immutable characteristics. That's a really, really big difference. That's a really, really big difference. And of course that big difference leads to differences in many other things. So I think it's actually worse now than during the Civil War for that reason, because as you say, that was the big difference at the end of the day. There were many other differences too in terms of lifestyle and things like that, and different conceptions, let's say, of patriotism, but nowhere near the kind of disagreement we have today. It's funny. Something that I noticed not long ago was that conservatives talk about national divorce, liberals talk about civil war. So in terms of their aspirations, and of course, someone on the left will say, "Oh no, of course we don't want civil war," but they'll be very glad to put down those evil right-wing insurrectionists who are fascists and who are destroying democracy. I mean, that's where we are right now. We can't rewind. There's no going back. If you can imagine a track of polarization and let's say acute rhetoric going up and ascending right now in American politics today, where does that end? What's the next step? What's 6 steps following that? What happens then? I think what happens then very clearly is that for half the country, the elimination or genocide of the other half of the country is completely justified. We're almost there. We're just a bit almost there. And then what happens then? What happens then when the left can no longer stand that we are alive? I mean, what did I think it was Pelosi say the other day? Just having that the January 6th insurrection continues in Republican state legislatures. Okay, Republican participation in politics, full stop, is insurrectionist, it's anti-democratic, and it's fascist. Okay, what happens next? What happens next after that? So, I think the idea that that a lot of people have that, I don't know, we press a button or something, or God forbid, there is some sort of attack from without. I mean, the whole place is gonna fall apart. And I mean, I was in New York City in 9/11. I know what that was. I worry that a situation right now, I think it's very clear that if the same thing happened again, I think we would go at each other's throats in a way that would, let's say, shock the world. Unfortunately, I mean, I'm not sharing this. I'm just saying this is where I believe we are. Even then, in Brooklyn, where I was living, I ran into people who were essentially cheering for the toppling of the towers. My next door neighbor said, "Who cares? It's just buildings." So even then, you had a little bit, a little part of, you had International Answer and a lot of these sort of anti-war groups that just said, you know what, we basically deserve 9/11. But that was a small minority. But today, the polarization is such that the thing would just explode.
So just to follow the thread, though, that you mentioned in the middle of that answer about the left talking about civil war, the right talking about national divorce, doesn't that point to the insurmountable fact that the actual powers that be that are largely controlled by the left would never let national divorce happen, right? I mean, I brought this up briefly in the column I wrote in The Spectator recently about national divorce, but one of the main cases for national divorce, and I've heard you make it a couple times, is that the progressive powers that be that control the media, the academy, the culture industry, federal bureaucracy, indeed, you can go down the list, military brass, they are so powerful and their power is so entrenched that the only way out for Red America is to essentially secede or divorce. But if they're so powerful, why would they ever let us do that, right? Why would they ever let Red America do that? And if they didn't let Red America do that, would Red America really stand a chance? Like the sort of red state militias against the guys who, control nukes? To me, that seems sort of unlikely.
Right.
And,
well, I think we're going to get the nukes based on where they are geographically. But the thing is that, look, it will be a time of catastrophe. I mean, not to repeat myself, but of course they don't want to let us go. On one hand, on the other hand, we're not ready to develop we're not ready to go. If we wanted to, part of what I am arguing is that we need to be ready to go. And that means to build things. And that assumes that this isn't going to happen tomorrow. But, if you don't get started, you don't get anywhere. And frankly, these institutions that I'm talking about, heck, we need these even if the United States stays together, just to have another option, to have banks, other financial institutions, to have, airlines, anything that you can imagine has been politicized. And, and frankly, we as folks on the right, we need other options. If, if I have my way and we do develop these things, which admittedly is unbelievably hard, but heck, hey, someone's got to talk about them. And further down the line, there is a collapse scenario. I want red states, or whatever they'll be called at that point, to be able to stand on their feet in the world and have these things, not to have the rump of sort of blue America's industrial economy or financial financial institutions. So I mean that's the argument. I don't think it's serious for people to say, let's do a national divorce. Let's sit down right now and figure out anything. I never thought that was a sort of coherent or probable answer to any of our ills. I'm just saying we need to be ready, because this is a thing that is going to happen, whether we like it or not, whether tomorrow or the next day or 50 years from now. But our continued existence, our way of life, depends on us building these things for ourselves.
One question I have, Dave, on the subject of foreign policy, because I know that's a major focus for you. Do you think that a national divorce, or the prospect of one, would potentially open up a point of vulnerability where our adversaries could, take advantage of that moment, or even I don't know how much this would impact it, but the recruitment of young men from red states into the U.S. military? Do you think that would be impacted at all to a point where it would be crippling?
Oh, that's got to stop. Oh no, I would suggest nobody enter the military. I think you'd be completely out of your mind if you did so today. If you're on the right, let them have it. Let it go down with the ship. It needs to be reformed from the ground up, and people need to be serious about, part of why I'm kind of saying this is that people need to wake up and be serious and understand how these institutions have completely changed. This is it just reminds me of, old Jews voting for the Democrat Party because they're thinking of John F. Kennedy. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. You've got to update your firmware. And as far as foreign threats, I mean, can it be worse than it is today? Yes, sure. It can be military, but we've got basically the same going on that's not military. We have amazing influence operations, specifically from China, but other places as well. I mean, China is the sort of big one, and I mean, are they taking advantage of the state of our disunion? I don't know. But I know that they're taking advantage of the political system as it is. They're taking advantage of the Democratic Party. They're taking advantage of a lot of people in the financial world who have made billions upon billions on building things in China, on moving the industrial base from the United States, etc. So I mean, there's a lot that's wrong now that could get worse in a sort of national divorce scenario. But then again, everything gets worse. I mean, you have a complete collapse of the U.S. financial system, and it leads, as it always does, to a complete collapse or almost complete collapse of the world economic system. So things are going to be very different, and in the ashes of in the rubble that once was the United States, it's not like China or Russia or any other country would be doing that great either.
So I think we got to wrap up soon. But the last thing that I just wanted to ask you about, Dave, was, we begin from similar premises in terms of the significance of the divisions that Americans are facing today. And I agree with you. I was out at the Claremont Institute this summer. This is something they talk about a lot, about building institutions in red states for a certain amount of autonomy, and building the capacity to resist progressivism at the national level. On board with all of that. To me, though, building those new institutions is a way out from the sort of impending sense of doom, the black pill about America, right? To me, that's a way to actually escape or avert the national crisis that would lead to a divorce scenario. Because if you and I agree, as I think we do, that a national divorce scenario would almost certainly be really ugly, right? Would be really horrific in any numbers of ways. It seems to me that we should be trying to do everything we can to avoid it at all costs. And I think the place where I break from some of the people who are talking about national divorce as an inevitability is nothing is an historic inevitability, right? I mean, in a certain sense, all empires collapse. That's true. Nothing lasts forever. But the idea that we are sort of on the brink of national divorce, that it's something that's right around the corner, is, to me, misses the fact of sort of human action, right? There are things we can do that can change the course of history. To me, starting by building new institutions in red states would actually be a great way to avoid that. And we should be committing all our resources to trying to avoid it rather than doing it in preparation for it to inevitably happen. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, but basically we agree. Building the institutions is essential. Building the institutions is essential, and it's the only way to avoid, what the horror that you're talking. Well, actually, no, it's not going to avoid a lot of the horror, but it will avoid a whole lot of the horror, and it will put us on a more confident footing, and this is something that sort of transcends just one industry. People want options. The United States, the folks that voted for Donald Trump in the last election number, I don't know, more than 70 million, right? That's large. That's more people than there are in France. And France, the French economy, is somehow able to support, or those people are able to support many, 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 many French businesses. There's no need for, for example, HEB in Texas doesn't need to be in North Dakota or in New Hampshire or Virginia in order to make a profit. They do just great in Texas. So we need to take this understanding and create a bunch of new sort of everythings. I mean, I know it sounds sort of unscientific and maybe unsophisticated, but at the end of the day, the scale of the problem is so huge that that everything is touched by a leftism that wants to that wants to either harm us or limit or be used to limit what we do. And so the problem is massive. And if talking about national divorce gets you to a place where you realize what the stakes are and you realize what needs to be done, then I think all to the good. My fear is that if we don't talk about what could eventually happen and what could come, then there's just no reason for it. Then you have a hard time convincing people to do hard, very difficult things if they don't see a wolf at the door. And I'm saying, here's the wolf. It's at the door. Start building.
Well, Dave, before we wrap up our episode, we want to ask you the question that we ask all of our guests, and that is what you believe conservatism is.
Ooh. All right, so that's a tough question. I could have answered it I would have answered it remarkably differently many years ago. Many years ago, I would have given a really pat answer that was probably a restatement of fusionism mixed with Burke and a reverence for tradition and things like that. I would have leaned more on the conception of on the importance, let's say, of liberty as a sort of open-ended, laissez-faire, valueless proposition. I still believe in liberty, but I don't think that it's valueless. I think it's or that is to say, I don't think that that we should sort of be agnostic and toss away preferences and sort of traditions and cultural norms that keep our society afloat. So it's sort of a reaction to a lot of the degeneracy in modern life today, and a realization that sort of the old laissez-faire conception of conservatism no longer really applies, because at the end of the day, if you have if you have people that believe corrupt things, you get corrupt outcomes. And the most important thing is a combination of liberty and order. And I know that sounds an awful like the old National Review, type slogan, order, liberty, and the founding. But in the founding, they were working with let's say different human capital and less corrupted human capital. So the importance of conservatism today is to sort of maintain that structure while, frankly, being more aggressive as far as maintaining cultural order and making sure that the society is not sick. So I know that's a long-winded answer, but I just wanted to take you from A to B.
I think Dave was one of the people I was most excited to ask this question, given the given the subject of our conversation. But Dave, thanks so much for joining us today. If people are interested in seeing more of your work or following you, where can they find you?
Well, you can find me at my Substack, Late Republic Nonsense. You can find me on Twitter, where I tweet more than I should. And you can find me on my website, davereaboi.com, where I can sell you a book or try to sell you a book.
Great. Well, thanks again for joining us, Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, Sec Modern Age articles, ISI books, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.